We are speaking about podcasts. We're speaking about podcasts in the US, and we want to talk about where the podcast ecosystem is right now and where it might be heading to. My name is Jon Hanschen. I'm here from Berlin originally. I founded a company called Movie Pilot, and then was lucky enough to go to Los Angeles to live there for the past 5 years, where I did something very similar. I did an agency for the big movie studios over there. But the movie industry and the podcast industry, they might have new tangibles where they come closer to each other again and where they touch each other, and where maybe the turmoil that the movie industry is in is also, something that has to be learned, what is maybe happening in the podcast industry. That was more complicated than I meant it. Doesn't matter. We're so happy to have Nick Quah here today with us. For those who don't know Nick, a friend of ours from the East Coast and a publisher of Hotpot News, and he's basically one of the experts in the B2B industry. Where is podcast going? How does the ecosystem look like? If you don't follow his newsletter, please do so. It's really a great read. And there's 2 versions, right? There's a free version. There's a free version. Oh, he's not on.
3, 5, 4, 4. Okay, great. Yeah, there are 2 versions. That's a free version that comes out on Tuesdays. One just went out a couple of minutes ago, and then there's a paid version as well.
It's a really great read, once a week, Hotpot News, and we'll draw a lot of the insights that you have out of that for today's session, hopefully. The goal of today's session, so I don't know what headline we basically had, the golden age of podcasting. I actually thought in the preparation of the session that maybe the loss of innocence would have been maybe the better title. And that has to do that the podcast industry in the US has been changing a lot in the last 12 to 18 months. There's a time before that, and there's a time where we're in right now.
Right.
And the question is, where is it heading to from here? From a German perspective, maybe just to frame it there a little bit, we believe it's always interesting to know what happens in the US. Why? Well, of course, as we produce podcasts, we'll have to live with the big platforms. We have to understand who controls this market, and what does the player or the players who will control this market, what do they want, what kind of content do they want, and how do they want us to produce and distribute it,
right.
And what kind of business models follow that. That all said, loss of innocence, why would we title it like that? Like, what did podcasting look like, let's say, up till a year from now, last year?
So just before I go into it, who here listens to podcasts in general? Just raise your hand. All right, who listens to American podcasts? Who listens to German podcasts? Okay, great. So there's an audience here, and there's an industry here. So for folks who are not sort of familiar with the history of podcasting as a technology, it's been around for about almost 15 years now. And for the longest time, podcasting took the shape of something that looked a lot like blogging, which is the sense that anybody could publish and anybody could access an audience. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to access a big audience, but the freedom and the potential that you could reach anybody that you wanted to was there. The past 5 years, specifically after 2014, 2014 being a huge year in which 2 things happened. One, Apple decided to bundle the podcast app by default on iPhones, which made it easier for many, many people to discover podcasts organically. That happened, and the second thing that happened was this thing called Serial, which was a sort of really big show for podcasting, for the podcast industry at the time. And it sort of supercharged the attention and the investment interest in podcasting. So the past 5 years has largely been a story about what happens when a lot of investment money goes into a very young space that was originally developed for freedom of publishing. And it all came to a head a couple of weeks ago when Spotify made 2 major acquisitions. One was of a company called Gimlet Media, which is the first major venture-backed podcast company. They bought them for $230 million.
Let me interrupt you there. Maybe I know that we always have to take into account that most likely half of the people know Gimlet, maybe the other half doesn't. Explain just briefly, whom did they buy? So Spotify, or before you do that, actually, tell us a little bit more. How does distribution till there look like? Where are podcasts distributed in the US, and what role does Spotify actually have in that?
So up until 2014, 2015, 2016, this period, podcasting has primarily been distributed over Apple iTunes. iTunes is now being phased out to be called something else, but a couple of years into the existence of podcasting, Steve Jobs decides to bundle podcasting as part of iTunes. And from there, just organically, Apple just develops the main market share of, if you were listening to a podcast, there's a very high chance that you're listening to it on Apple. And Apple largely practiced a hands-off approach. They didn't push for any monetization. They didn't push for advertising. They just let people do whatever they want in podcasting in the iTunes section.
They don't interfere, so to speak. They give you the infrastructure, but there's no real, there's no team that tells you.
Yeah, they were just like a very forgiving parent. You do whatever you want. And as a result, a lot of people just did whatever they wanted. And it engendered this community of people who make stuff and people who listen to stuff. Between 2014 and the past couple of weeks, there are a few other platforms that's been trying to capture the market as well.
And one of them Spotify.
One of them Spotify.
So what is the position of Spotify in the, are they relevant in the US when it comes to podcasting?
So they're relevant in two senses now. One, they have officially spent more than $400 million American dollars acquiring podcast companies. They've acquired 2 content companies. One of them is Gimlet Media. And they acquired sort of an advertising and hosting technology company that specializes in podcasts called Anchor. We don't know what they want to do with them just yet with these assets, but they are willing to spend that much money because they are betting on the future of Spotify being not just music, but also talk content, all sorts of audio content, and they want to start with podcasting.
And I assume like everybody who here in the studio or in the audience basically is a podcast producer must have read that 230 million
for Gimlet
paid
alone.
for Gimlet Media.
Yeah.
Like explain to us, why is that a sensible investment, or is it America?
I have no idea if it's a sensible investment. I have never had that much money, so
explain us again like what Gimlet had at that point. Like how old were they? Who are they? Who's behind it?
Gimlet was founded in 2014 by 2 people. One, his name is Alex Bloomberg. He most famously used to work with This American Life, and he went on to build a podcast of his own for National Public Radio, which is the American public broadcaster, called Planet Money. And during that experience, he sort of had a sense that he could actually build a for-profit company around podcasting. He sort of saw the trends there. So he went out and he raised a bunch of venture capital to build essentially just a podcast studio. And it was the first time that a podcast, just a creation studio just for content, a company of that sort raised that much money. And this is the first big acquisition that we've seen. It's kind of interesting that he used to be a public radio producer, and now he's a podcast millionaire, I guess.
He's maybe like the first kind of podcast millionaire in that sphere?
I don't think he's the first podcast millionaire. I think he's the biggest, probably. I don't know.
Now, something like that happens, and normally, like you just described, the scene up till then of podcast producers especially remembers or reminds you, as you say, of the blogging atmosphere, the free internet, the times, when maybe money was secondary and the passion to produce was first. Like, how did this news that a company that was, 4 years old got bought for $230 million, how did it impact on the emotional, let's say, balance of the podcast ecosystem?
A lot of people are very confused. A lot of people are really excited because there is an opportunity to get money now. There's a sense that if you did try to dedicate your life to this industry, or if you try to risk a lot of your money in it, you might get something back. But there's also a huge segment of community in the American podcast community that had very strong negative feelings, largely because podcasting was started for largely a political reason, which is you did not have to go through a middleman or a publisher or a radio station in order to get the word out. Mm-hmm. One of the very few podcasts ever is a podcast called Open Source, and it was started by this former New York Times journalist who was very frustrated at the New York Times in the way that they covered the Iraq War. So he worked together with the person who then developed podcasting as technology so he could create this show and reach people on his own. And you kind of flash forward 15 years into the future, and you have a situation where this formerly political technology is now getting investment money and sort of capitalistic notions and venture capital into it. So the story there kind of changes. And the question is, for the community that is there now, do they hold to the original ideals, or do they sort of take this to the next level and see where this industry takes them?
And this question basically manifested, if we can see it correctly, like in a second big announcement that was just a couple of weeks ago, also big in your newsletter and featured and analyzed in it. It was the announcement of a new company, a new platform that suddenly emerged as a startup, which is called Luminary. Tell us about them.
So Luminary is a startup that's trying to be very explicitly the Netflix for podcasts, which is to say that they're trying to build a subscription platform that you pay $8 a month for, and you have access to the exclusive portfolio of podcast content. They had raised $100 million by the time that they launched, which was about 2 weeks ago now. And the launch was not a very good launch.
What happened? Well, why not?
The community essentially turned against them for 2 reasons. One, they had combined this whole metaphor of a Netflix service with just becoming a normal podcast app. So they took other people's podcast feeds without really, on the one hand, clearing and getting permissions appropriately.
So basically, they take the free RSS feeds,
that's right,
podcasts that are not behind a paywall till here, and they just add them to their own service, but have not basically asked anybody for permission. Kind of the old Silicon Valley habit.
A little bit. Previously, the culture is that you could do that as long as you're allowing normal analytics and data to go back. But also that there's this sense that if you as a podcast player succeeds, that all the other podcasts that you take the feeds from will succeed as well. There's a general interpretation among the podcast community that if Luminary succeeds, it's a zero-sum game because they would use the free podcast to drive more people to pay $8 a month to consume content that's not theirs. And a lot of the people in the podcast community saw that as a sort of anti-competitive move, and they kind of made themselves known. This sort of told us 2 things. One, that there is still this sense that podcasting should be open. There's still this very strong idealism among the podcast community that you can't just show up here and not and completely change the political character of the way podcasting is supposed to work. But the second thing is also that, like, if you raise $100 million and you're trying to go in and start a business, try to do it the right way. That's like another big lesson here. And unfortunately, Luminary kind of bungled the first week, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll fail. It's just that it's a really, really rough start for them.
So let's try to dissect here, because I feel like it's nearly 2 conversations at the same time. Like, one is from a creator's perspective. New players emerge on the market. There's new opportunities, and we'll come to that in a second. And the other one is, first off, but who's going to control and dominate basically the distribution in the mid and long run. And that is what I thought, like, in the beginning of my little complicated kind of intro. You know, when I think about the movie industry, we saw, like, for years not a lot of change and nothing happens, and suddenly Netflix appears on the stage, or Amazon Studio, as Philip, who was just here on stage as well, and changes the rules of the game up to Germany. You know, suddenly we have offices here, and Netflix is moving to Berlin, as far as we know. Amazon Studios has an office in Germany now. So the rules, basically, how producers and audiovisual producers, in that case, how they produce, with whom they produce, what kind of content they produce, suddenly changes. So the question, of course, is, like, who is going to dominate from here onwards the platform and the distribution of podcasts? Is it going to change? Are we going to see a bigger fight? Is there going to be a bigger influx of more players?
So it's going to change no matter what. And the question is, was it always going to change, or was it always going to be this way? And I think one of the interesting sort of tensions is, as podcasting grows more popular, you're going to get more audiences, you're going to get more people who want to make podcasts, and you're just going to get more competition as a result. So it's, in its own way, it's a victim of its own success, right? Like, that's kind of how these things work. It's a little bit like gentrification, you know, like a neighborhood is at first cheap, and then it has some cool stuff, and then it attracts people in, people bring their money, it raises the rent, pushes everybody back out. It's a dynamic that we've seen before in many other spheres. But the thing about podcasting is that it's still built on the idea of an open ecosystem, that anybody can publish. It's just that, like, when you publish on your own and you make your own sort of podcast, or you make your own publication, or you make your own show, it's hard, it's expensive. And so there's this sort of challenge in which, can you be better, or can you get more back from your podcast in a way that doesn't ultimately ruin the system? And I think that's one of the ways in which, like, Gimlet thinks about itself, is that, like, it's elevating the podcast industry by increasing the value of the way investors and advertisers see podcasting. And in a way, it will bring money in, and it'll help spread money around more podcast creators. But the question is sort of who controls those decisions in the long term. And that's the tricky part.
But allow me to press you on the question, like, what do you personally expect? Like, will we see more than one platform, or is Apple going to dominate this market? Like, what are the market shares right now, in your opinion, between Spotify, Apple? Luminary is 0, I guess, till here, but
$15,000 apparently, I know.
Where will we be in a couple of years there? What do you think?
I mean, if I knew that answer, I'd be super rich by now, but...
We're working on it?
So Edison Research, which is a market research firm in America, does this annual report called the Infinite Dial. And it's the longest running report that attempts to size or give us a clear sense of how big the American podcast audience is. And this year they introduced a new question for the first time, which is if you're a monthly podcast listener, if you listen to podcasts regularly, what's your preferred app? And then they bring up Spotify as one of the options. And we saw that there is a small chunk, but a growing chunk of people who listen to podcasts regularly who are using Spotify as their main app. And so we have Spotify as a potential contender. And I think it will grow over time because the thing about Spotify is that they can flip a lot of people who previously do not know what podcasting is, who use Spotify for music, who can discover it on the platform and then become podcast listeners. And then they begin to associate podcasting with Spotify. That's an arc that could happen. And I think that's what we're going to see. So the other contenders are maybe Pandora. Pandora just launched something called the Podcast Genome Project a few weeks ago, which is essentially taking what they did with the Music Genome Project and applying it to podcasts. Maybe that'll work. I don't know. But there is a very possible future in which you have Spotify and Apple going at it. Maybe Audible, but they're not really participating in the ecosystem in the way that we thought that they were. They had an original podcast team a couple of years ago before they pivoted to completely shift the way that they think about programming there. But that itself kind of should make us ask a question. When we talk about podcasts, are we talking about the technology, or are we talking about the kind of show, or are we talking about the people who make these things? And I think as we move forward in time, we're going to be forced to ask that question. It's like when we talk about podcasts, are we just talking about audio blogs, or are we talking about shows? And it's a cultural question as much as it is a political question.
And it's also a question, like, in my imagination, these services try to build something, or at least like Luminary, Audible that you mentioned, and they need to produce something that people are willing to make the jump behind the paywall, that they go for the subscription and that they're ready, to pay $7, $8, $9 a month to basically get access to this kind of content. We made the comparison again in the movie world, or TV world. Netflix really started to be on the radar in everybody's conversation when they had their House of Cards moment. And when they had released House of Cards, and for the first time you had this feeling like, oh, I only can watch that there. I cannot get this show anywhere else on the web. And it's not a secondary license that they've just licensed from anybody else. And this idea of Netflix originals basically was born. I'm speaking for Netflix as if I don't know. In your case, are we waiting for that to happen on these kind of platforms as well, if they go for subscription models? And can I, as creator, anticipate a bright future where I'm basically asked, can you please produce the House of Cards for podcasts, or for the audio world?
So I think you have to break that question into two buckets. One is we need another business model for podcasting. We need to diversify the business model. Right now, it's mostly advertising driven. And it's mostly sort of direct support, like a Patreon style. If you really like the show, contribute $7 a month, that kind of thing. The problem with that is when the ecosystem's only ad-driven and it's only Patreon-driven, it only benefits a certain kind of show. Mostly interview kinds of shows, mostly shows that are weekly and indefinite. It doesn't really benefit proportionally something like an 8-part miniseries because you run the ads and it's over. Maybe you'll capture it in a long tail. So there is a need. There is definitely a path for somebody to build a subscription business here. The second bucket is, how do you build a subscription business? And I think the argument that Luminary tried to make, and to some extent another company called Stitcher, with their Stitcher Premium service, the argument is, if you make good original content, people will want to pay for it. I don't think that's the correct interpretation of Netflix. I think the main thing you want to solve is, like, how do you make my life easier as a person who consumes this stuff? I personally leave my Netflix subscription charging, not because I'm really interested in the latest shows that come up, but largely because I'm a really lazy person. And I don't really want to look for options. Netflix solves a very specific problem for me, which is I'm too lazy and too cheap to go out to the movies all the time. I'm too lazy and too cheap to read on what the TV schedules are. It will solve that problem for me, and the original stuff is value add. So that threshold, that sort of user case, is something that can still be solved in podcasting. You just need to find the right foothold in, and I don't know what that is.
Mm-hmm. And from a creator's perspective now, if we switch to that side, away from the platform and rather to the podcast producers, people who hope now new money maker and new pots of money are opening up. I can go to Luminary. I might be able to sell an original over there. what should the anxieties, on the other hand, be with this kind of turmoil in the platform market? Like, is there any kind of, fears would be maybe too much of a word, but things that they could, anticipate that could be bad kind of developments from their perspective?
So there are two general directions, right? One is just this general sense that if the capitalists come in, everything's ruined. Like there is that sort of like impulse, because we've seen this over and over again. We saw this with blogging, we saw this with the movie industry, we saw this with music. We saw this in many, many forms of culture, that once the people with institutionalized money come in, it completely changes the competitive dynamic.
Right.
You either need to have a relationship with these people in order to compete on a large scale, or you're not in the game at all. And so there's just this general fear that if you're not aligned with the right people, or if you're not in that sort of spirit to chase after that kind of money, you will get phased out over time. That's a real concern, and that's a genuine problem. And the solution to solve that for that community of creators who just don't want to deal with big money, that's another question to answer. But the other direction is, it's like that Game of Thrones line, like chaos is a ladder. It's an opportunity for people to seize the market right now. And it's an opportunity to take advantage of the chaos and figure out your way through it. And I think a lot of podcasters have started podcast studios knowing that they can use that as a card to figure out better relationships with Spotify, better relationships with Apple, better ways to make money. And hopefully that continues, and hopefully it stays this fluid. But somebody's going to win and figure out the market at some point, and that might just change the equation.
And on the other hand, yesterday you made a session also about how storytelling innovations basically drove the kind of explosion of the audience and the love of a bigger audience, right, basically, of the podcast phenomena in the US. Do you expect these kind of leaps and then jumps forward in the sense of creativity? Do you expect them behind paywalls to happen, or are they happening more in the free kind of blog world, as you described it before?
I mean, the answer as we know it right now is that we have not seen any data coming out of the paywall world. Like, right. We just have not seen, there has been no real attempt to figure out whether that works until now. Maybe Luminary will show us that. But right now, all innovations that we've seen is a function of the fact that it was an open publishing ecosystem. I don't think Serial would have been allowed to play on public radio over the broadcast airwaves. The way it was structured, the way they told the story, the sensitivity of the story is so difficult that a traditional gatekeeper would not have allowed that podcast, that radio show to exist. Same thing with the other popular stuff, WTF and Mark Maron, the Joe Rogan Experience, Coil Girlfriend is an independent podcast. No gatekeeper would have allowed those shows to exist. So we know with evidence right now that the open podcasting ecosystem has been a really strong driver of creative innovation. The question is when the money comes in and when the competitive dynamics and the stakes rise, will we see creators step up and also take those risks alongside? And I think this is less a question about what the platforms will allow, and it's all about what creators will do. Are they incentivized appropriately to take risks? I don't know if the answer is yes yet.
And there's one thing that's very specific about the European markets, in particular, in comparison to the US market, that here, of course, the audio sector is unthinkable without the public radio system that we have and the public broadcasting system that we have. That might play an integral role how these American platforms that also come to Germany will find, different obstacles and or partners when working over here in Germany. I know that you know a lot about the UK. How do you there play out the role of the BBC, and how does the BBC help or hinder basically the podcast scene over there in that sense?
I've heard both sides in the UK that the BBC has been a really important force of podcasting. I've also heard the position that the BBC, because they're so powerful in the UK, that they completely drowned out the entire podcast community. I kind of feel like every country is going to go down their own route. I think in Germany here as well, you have various players that could actually usher along more development in the podcast industry here. You have the public radio, the public broadcasters here, Audible is here, and my understanding is that audiobooks is a huge segment of media consumption in Germany, and Audible Originals is a layer that's really, really important for potential innovation and potential money to creators who work in the audio medium here. It all comes down to will the people listen, or will there be stuff made for audiences in those respective countries? In the UK, the primary genre is football podcasts for good reason, and it was something that they are served, that they were previously underserved by many other sort of radio outlets in the ways that they wanted it. there might be different genres, there might be different needs here, and there might be different ways in which this industry sort of evolves. And I don't think what happens in America can be replicated here, simply because the culture is really different and the needs are really different. And so, I don't know. I'm excited to see what you guys can come up with. I would not look to the US for reference points because we are a mess.
It's a thriving economy, on the other hand. And I think there's also maybe last question there, because I see that our time is already running up again. Last question in that regard. Berlin is a startup city, startup capital of Europe. Ideas, there's so many right now, also other smaller startups, but interesting startups happening in the podcast ecosystem right now. Not just storytelling-wise, I'm thinking of Red Circle, of Descript.
Red Circle is German?
No, that's yours. America.
Oh, that's
in America. I'm speaking about America.
Right.
So what is, maybe last question, the most interesting kind of startup that you have seen happening in the last 6 months in the US, in the podcast industry, that is not a podcast studio?
So 6 months is way too short. I still think that Descript, which is so Descript is essentially a transcriptions platform that is tailored to help radio producers and podcasters edit podcasts as if they're editing it as a text on a page. That kind of stuff is really, really important, and very few people are innovating on that level. Everybody's trying to figure out how do you win the audience, how do you improve analytics, how do you improve advertising technology. But there are so many other pain points that a radio producer and a podcast producer goes through, like cleaning up transcriptions, booking, like just running a CRM or a CMS, all the aspects of podcast creative production. They can all be innovated on because it's still so hard to make a podcast, and there are so many things to improve upon. So I would be looking in the other direction of the stack. People want to innovate on the audience side, fine. But nobody's thinking about the life of the producer. And the life of the producer needs a lot of help. And I think that's where innovation should also be applied to.
And a lot of startup ideas seem to be possible exactly in that kind of sphere. Thank you. We'll take 2 questions, I believe. We only have time maybe for 2 or 3 questions, if there is questions from the audience. Do we have a microphone? I don't see anything. Over there.
Could you explain what's the difference between Luminary and a podcast app like Overcast, except that you pay for Luminary?
So we thought that Luminary was just going to be a closed app, that you download it and you cannot access it unless you pay $8 a month, or you go down the sort of free trial funnel. But when they launched, they look like a normal podcast app. So in structure, it doesn't look too different from something like Overcast or even Stitcher, which has a Stitcher Premium aspect. And that was the problem. The problem is that they, in a lot of ways, misrepresented what the product was going to be, and therefore a lot of the publishing partners sort of misunderstood what exactly the value proposition was. So in structure, Luminary is the same, very same. But in practice and in execution, it's a fundamentally different company, just based on the long arc of it. Hopefully that answers your question.
One last question over there.
Hi. What do you think? Like, discovering new podcasts is still really hard for everyone. What do you think? Who do you think has the best solution right now to discovering new podcasts?
So for the longest time, and I think it's still the case right now, that podcast publishers would say the best way to learn about podcasts is through other podcasts or through word of mouth. And I think for the past 6-7 years, the major thesis is that discoverability is a problem you can solve with technology. I don't know if that's true. I think it's a problem that you can solve with marketing. I think the fact that a lot of new podcasts that take a lot of money, they don't apply the same marketing strategies as a book launch does, or as a movie or a television show launch does. I think there's still a lot of that kind of circuits that we haven't figured it out yet. And then there's also just a larger thing, like how do you learn about new movies or new books, right? You read about it in the paper, you see trailers before the movies and stuff. These are all little cultural steps that hasn't really been executed yet. So I think we can solve it on that level before we can solve it on a technology level. But if the answer is there's going to be this new platform that tells you exactly what you want to listen to next, if that actually is the future, it's a really sucky future because you don't want one person to determine the winners and losers. And so that's also the other side of this equation is for every one solution, it's going to cause 10 more problems of power. And I think that's a little bit of what we're looking at.
Last question for me. Your favorite podcast right now, what should we all be listening to on our way home?
I'm a horrible person to ask this question. It's right now the NBA season. I'm a huge basketball fan, so I'm only listening to basketball podcasts right now. So I can't really answer that question.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Nick Quah.